October 15th, 1944. The morning sat heavy and low, as if the world itself had decided to crouch and listen. Fog hugged the pines in rocky ridges like a curtain dropped between two rooms. Men moved through that curtain with the slow, cautious rhythm of people who know that one wrong sound can turn the day into a list of names. 42 Americans, a single platoon, pressed uphill. Above them, the high ground was not empty. A well-prepared German position of roughly 52 men occupied every visible ridge and knoll. The Americans were below, exposed and outgunned by the advantage of gravity and preparation. They faced a set of choices so grim the men barely let themselves name them. Discover the war cry that made 52 Germans panic in battle. A single voice, a practiced cadence, and a knowledge passed down across generations would soon stand between a platoon and disaster. But before that voice spoke, there was only cold, wet earth beneath boots, breath that fogged into the air, and the sense that something old and quiet could, in a matter of minutes, decide who lived and who did not. If this story pulls you in, subscribe. We dig into untold World War II moments like this every week. Lieutenant James Morrison had been a school teacher before the war. His voice in the field was steady, not because he had forgotten how to be afraid, but because he had learned to sort fear into motion. He paced the narrow ledge like someone checking the hems of an invisible map, one eye on his men, the other on the contour of the ground and the enemy beyond it. Morrison was not a headline kind of hero. He carried the quiet, practical authority of a man used to organizing thoughts into lessons for restless teenagers. Now he organized men into survival. Private First Class Thomas Bay was almost everything Morrison was not. Navajo, young, and given to a watchful stillness, he had been assigned as the platoon's radio operator and scout. He wore the uniform like anyone else, but his ears remembered things his eyes might miss, the way hills spoke back to sound, the way a canyon swallowed a shout and spat it out miles away. Bay had been taught as a boy by his grandfather how voices could move through the landscape, how to throw a call so it would scatter and return as many answers. He knew, without book or manual, what echoes could do to a man's imagination in the dark. In the army, he carried a radio, a pack, and the kind of knowledge that at home had been treated as curiosity or nuisance. In the woods that morning, that knowledge had the shape of a plan. Sergeant William Chen had been hardened by the kind of combat that leaves a memory of steel in the mouth. He moved with efficient menace, not reckless, but certain. The young man from Detroit, Private Robert Kowalski, had a face that still held the softness of the city's summer streets. He kept his helmet tucked back on his head like someone who hadn't yet learned to think of himself as a weapon.
Together, they made up the small, fragile mix of experience and raw nerve that Morrison commanded. Across the ridge, the German line crouched in earthworks and behind tangled saplings stripped of cover. The defenders were alert, disciplined, experienced in holding ground. Their commander, whose name remains indefinito in the records, and who might be called simply the German commander, directed a small network of soldiers who trusted him to read the terrain and to hold. From the Germans' vantage, the Americans below were a potential nuisance, one that had to be dealt with, until the morning's sounds told a different story. The first light revealed the problem in clearer terms. Reconnaissance showed the Germans numbered roughly 52. High ground meant firing arcs favored the defenders. Entrenched positions meant each man had fields of fire worked out and protected by earth and log. The Americans' equipment was standard issue. Their numbers were honest and small. To assault uphill against emplacements was to invite a slaughter no calculator could justify. To retreat meant giving up ground and possibly allowing the enemy to consolidate and push. To surrender was beyond the pride of men who had already seen too much of victory and defeat to consider capitulation lightly. The decision set the platoon in a cold calculus, one reckless option that would likely end in blood, one that would cede the initiative, and one that would leave them alive but crushed in spirit. Morrison walked the line of his men as if he were checking their breath. He listened to private conversations, the shuffle of gear, the metallic click of a helmet strap. He watched faces and watched the mountain beyond them. The fog lay like a sheet across the valley, and sound moved like it had a mind of its own. A shot fired in the wrong place might ricochet through the mist and tell a different story than the one they wanted it to tell. The lieutenant's training had not prepared him to hear the history inside a boy's memory of a canyon. B stepped forward with an idea that, at first blush, seemed to belong more to folklore than to doctrine. He offered to use traditional Navajo calls and time-tested acoustic techniques to create the illusion of a much larger force maneuvering in the woods. The plan was audaciously simple. Move through the tree line, emit a sequence of war cries and calls at varying timbres and intervals, exploit the fog and the tremendous echoing properties of the ravine so the sounds would appear to come from multiple locations at once, and coordinate minimal visible troop movements to suggest flanking and encirclement. It would be deception fashioned from human voice, weather, and terrain. For a few beats, Morrison's face registered doubt. Army manuals taught flanking, suppression, and artillery. They did not catalog how a voice could be used as a weapon.
But the alternatives were worse, and the man in front of him had a radio strapped to his back and a calm certainty that the ground itself could be used for misdirection. "You think that'll work?" Morrison asked. Bay's answer was not a boast. It was a demonstration folded into a memory. He described simply how his grandfather had stood on a ridge and sent a call into a canyon that returned as though men had answered from three sides. He spoke of the timing, of shifting position to let echoes mimic movement, and of the possibility that an enemy, dampened by fear and unfamiliar with those particular calls, would overestimate what they faced. "We can make them think it's more than us," he said. Morrison made a decision that carried the slant of desperation but the shape of hope. He greenlit the plan. The lieutenant's words were few. "Do it," he said. They were the kind of words that Ridge Earth remembers, small executables of command spoken into potential doom. The men began to move into positions that would support Bay's work. Small squads to the flanks would create just enough of a visual hint of movement. A squad would make a show of preparing to climb a small visible slope and then fall back into concealment. A few rifles would crack once, at a distance, to simulate contact. Nothing would be reckless, nothing would be wasted. The theater was set. Fog, voice, movement. Before Bay stepped out, they prepared in the quiet way infantry does. Ammunition was checked, radios listened to, maps glanced at with the same kind of reverence someone might afford a prayer book. There was a choreography to the preparation. In a dozen small gestures, a platoon signed its intent to attempt the impossible. Each man felt as if he was balancing on the edge of two stories, one of catastrophic failure and one of improbable misdirection. In the center of that tense balance stood Bay, whose knowledge had been stored in oral memory and in the muscle memory of a lifetime walking ridges that were his home long before they became the stage of war. A reconnaissance patrol had returned with the most troubling detail. The German positions were alert and their lines interiorly connected. Patrolmen spoke of unseen trenches, of sentries who spoke harshly into the mist, and of a command presence that suggested experience. The patrimony of fear, stories of encirclement and rearguard massacres, lived in the enemy's bones as much as it did in the Americans. The German troops had endured long nights in defensive terrors. They were seasoned in the very psychology that Bay hoped to exploit. Bay's background in the army halos around his stillness. He had been trained to operate a radio, to transmit messages in breaks and code, to be the link between his unit and the rest of the world. But his most valuable asset that day was not the radio's electrons, it was his voice, and the memory of how sound could be made to tell a story. He moved with the quiet cadence of someone who steps into a place he knows intimately. When he spoke with Morrison, it was in short, factual phrases. He described the cadence he would use, how he would vary pitch and volume, and how he would relocate at precise intervals to create a sense of motion. The men listening began to imagine figures moving where none yet existed. At the same time, Sergeant Chen took a small team and rehearsed the feints that would provide visual support. A couple of men would rustle in the underbrush at different points along a ridge. Others would fire a single round and then hold. Kowalski, the young man from Detroit, felt his palms press against his rifle in a reflex that told him his nerves were sharp but under control. He looked at B.A. and found a calm he hadn't expected to find that morning. There was trust in the look between them that had nothing to do with rank or age, and everything to do with the shared desire to keep each other breathing. This was not theater in the casual sense. It was tactical theater, precision staged to deceive trained soldiers. Acoustic deception is a practice as old as war itself, but few modern commanders had hard manuals on how to jam a human enemy with the echo of a voice. The ingenuity lay in the details. To vary the calls so they suggested different timbres and sizes of groups, to let some calls be high and short, others low and long, to move and call from different elevations so that returning echoes would suggest shifting locations, to exploit the fog's dampening and the ravine's amplification so that sound folded back onto itself and escaped analysis. B.A. planned to treat the ridgeline like a musical score. Morrison issued the final orders, his voice a controlled instrument. Silence on the radio except for essential signals, no unnecessary firing, conserve ammo, watch flanks, prepare to seize the ridge at the first sign the enemy faltered. He did not promise victory, he promised discipline.
The men moved into the choreography, nerves taped down by habit, training, and a mutual comprehension of the stakes. The terrain itself conspired with the plan. The ridges and gullies formed natural reverb chambers. Where a shout in open country drops off quickly, here sound could be caught and returned like a coin tossed into a well. Fog, a dampening wrapper, also diffused directionality, making it difficult to locate a sound's origin. B.A. thought in these acoustic terms the way a hunter thinks in the wind. He knew where to stand, so his voice would be made many by the land itself. He also knew that German soldiers, hearing unfamiliar and layered cries, would not necessarily interpret them as a single man experimenting with echoes. For men on the lookout, unfamiliar calls could be interpreted as other units, as allied ethnic fighters, or as an unseen force flanking their position. Suspicion breeds caution. Caution breeds withdrawal.
As Bays slipped away to his first post, he carried no banner, no explosive, only his voice and a pocket of carefully folded patience. The platoon adjusted the light on their faces to shadow and tightened their grips. Time dilated. Every breath seemed to stretch into possibility. The mist thickened. The German sentries shifted their heads, trying to find the source of sounds that had not yet come. The mountain waited as if holding its breath. The plan unfolded in layers. Bay chose his first calling point near a hollow where echoes favored high frequencies. He would emit short, sharp cries there, then move quietly to a deeper ravine and send longer, lower ululations. By the time he reached a third point, the layered pattern of sound would be, in theory, indistinguishable from the noises of a larger unit moving and calling to each other. The American feints, the brief crack of rifle fire and the flicker of movement on the far flank, were timed to confirm what the ears suggested, that men were maneuvering, perhaps in greater numbers than the Germans could match. Halfway through the preparation, a patrol returned with information that raised the stakes. A young German conscript, a pale fellow who might have been barely 20, had been seen whispering sharply into his helmet, his eyes wide as if he had just witnessed something that did not fit his training. The patrol did not know the infantryman's name. He remained a face in a memory and a confirmation that the defenders were on edge. Awareness in a line, once reached, is contagious. The men who dug trenches are often the last to be surprised, but surprise finds them too, in the place where sleep is thin. Morrison took a breath and reminded himself, and the men, that deception required more than sound. It required confidence. If they moved with hesitance, the ruse would unspool. So they moved as if each small movement was the part of a larger plan, walked as if a larger force was already at hand, and placed themselves in the landscape in ways that made them believable. The beauty and danger of psychological warfare is that perception can outweigh reality when conditions are right. There was no time for second-guessing. Orders were passed quietly. The platoon's small band of men folded into the terrain, becoming background actors in a drama that might save them or condemn them. Bay left the radio with explicit instruction. His transmissions would be minimal, his primary weapon voice. If the worst happened, he was to cease calling and prepare to fall back into the platoon's line. The men understood the contingency. The gravity of that understanding settled over them like a glove. As Bay made his first move, the German line below tightened. Their commander, indefinido in the fragments of accounts that remain, ordered an increase in vigilance. Men leaned over their parapets, peered into the fog, and whispered into the gaps between fear and training. That commander was not rash.
He had seen attacks and counterattacks. He knew how an enemy could be coaxed into foolishness by a false front. But he also watched the horizon of his own experience and noted the hazards of assumption. If reports of encirclement had haunted him before, their ghosts would not be easily dismissed. At the first calling point, Bay drew the breath of someone about to sing, and then spoke. The sound he sent into the hollow was neither a parody nor a caricature. It was a call with musical shape, a sharp rise, a sudden drop, a tailing off into the mist. For an ear trained to map directionality, the sound did not offer a clean line back to its origin. It returned like a bird call repopulated by echoes. That was the first trick. The call seemed to come from 3 or 4 points at once, each echo skewed slightly in timbre. For soldiers who had been taught to read the land and trust their ears, the effect planted a root of uncertainty. Bay did not stay. He shifted quickly, silently, to the next location. There he layered his next call with a different pitch, letting the low tone rattle against a stone face in a way that suggested a larger throat. Each relocation created the impression of movement. Each new timbre suggested different groups calling back. The Germans, listening, could not immediately reconcile the scale of the sounds with the sightline. A handful of small men moving under cover could not plausibly produce the cacophony they perceived. On the American side, subtle gestures confirmed the illusion. A squad would rustle near a ridge, another would be seen briefly and then vanish into concealment. A single rifle shot cracked once, as if striking contact, and then silence. The combined sensory input, sight of small movements, the layered calls echoing through the fog, the rifle shot, constructed in the German mind an image of coordinated movement and possible encirclement. It is worth noting that fear in combat is not simply a matter of courage, it is a story told by senses under stress. When those senses begin to tell different versions of the same event, the mind fills in the worst possibilities. Back on the ridge, Sergeant Chen watched the Germans' response, reading the sign that mattered most: hesitation. Under a competent commander, hesitation is rare. Soldiers act. If the German commander began to hesitate, if he ordered conservation and withdrawal over pressing a suspected encirclement, that decision would reshape the immediate geography of battle. But the Germans had to be nudged toward that decision without giving them a reason to counterattack fully prepared. That was the delicate art the Americans sought to perform. Kowalski felt the hairs at his neck prick as the layered sounds drifted toward their positions. The calls were not just noises, they were insinuations. He thought of the young faces back home, of the barbershops and avenues of Detroit he had left, and then returned his attention to the rock at his feet.
He tightened his fingers around the stock of his rifle and felt himself become part of the plan. There is a peculiar clarity that descends in moments like that. The world narrows to the size of the problem and the size of the solution. For Kowalski, it was a lesson in how small acts, a rustle, a call, a step, can ripple outward. Meanwhile, the fog played its role as both ally and liar. Where sight failed, sound took its place. Echoes smoothed edges, made distance meaningless, and turned the landscape into an uncertain thing. Again, this was not mystical, it was physics and memory converging. Bayes' technique applied known acoustic properties to the human tendency to overestimate threat when clarity is absent. He relied on trained instincts, to be cautious when the unknown is loud. On the German side, reports of an unseen movement circulated. A sentry reported hearing voices to his left. Another swore he had seen a shadow move where no man should be. Their commander, measuring risk and reward, conferred with his deputy. Perhaps they thought it was a scouting party or a feint. Perhaps they worried it might be the beginning of a larger assault. Each hypothesis required a different reaction: a probe forward to identify the threat, a consolidation to prepare for attack, or a withdrawal to preserve force. None of these decisions was trivial. None was made easily in the whitewash of fog and doubt. Morrison's platoon waited for the critical sign, the point at which the Germans decided that the risk of being surrounded outweighed the value of the ground they held. The Americans would not waste the moment if it came. They prepared to seize the ridge the moment discipline cracked. That the plan hinged on the opponent making a choice influenced more by perception than by objective force, carried both beauty and danger. If the Germans responded aggressively, the ruse would fail, and the small platoon might find itself in a firefight on terms dictated by the enemy. If, however, perception played its part, the moment of confusion could be transformed into a clean, decisive seizure of the position. Bay moved again, deeper into the gullies where the echoes shaped themselves into shadows. His calls began to take on a tempo, short then long, rising and breaking, repeated in irregular intervals to avoid pattern recognition. He varied volume and placement. From one hollow, a call would burst like a stone. From another, a long, low call would mourn into the fog. The layering created a soundscape that a human brain, eager for narrative, interpreted as movement, organization, cohesion. Soldiers on the ridge, trained to detect such patterns, began to discuss the possibility of an encirclement. Caution turned toward withdrawal. The Germans dug deeper into their problem. They weighed the risk of waiting for reinforcements that might not come against the risk of being enveloped. The commander discussed options and clipped urgent words.
A withdrawal required order and discipline. Done poorly, it would become a rout, handing the Americans not just the ridge, but the spoils of an abandoned position, including weapons, supplies, and the psychological victory that follows. Better to pull back methodically if the situation suggested encirclement. But how to be sure? At that moment, ambiguity is a commander's cruelest companion. On the American side, the feints remained small but purposeful. Chen's men revealed themselves briefly on a spur and then disappeared, leaving the impression of an active flank. One of the small teams made a show of moving upward as if to contest the nearest knob, only to fall back to concealment and watch. Each action was designed to reinforce the auditory illusion in the minds of the defenders. None of it was loud or reckless enough to draw a prepared counterattack. The point was to shape perception, not to begin an actual firefight. In the thick of that fog, human psychology did the rest. The German soldiers, tired and keyed to the possibility of encirclement by partisan or indigenous forces, weighed the cost of standing against a force they could not see. Rumors from prior engagements, tales in which unnumbered units were cut off and destroyed, haunted them. The memory of such events gives shape to fear. Once burned, twice wary. When a mind expects an enemy around every corner, layered, unfamiliar cries can finalize that expectation into a working plan. They began preparing to pull back the line to avoid being cut off. Back among the Americans, a hush fell as if the world was listening for the next sound in a story. B.A. moved towards his third calling point. The calls had been working. The Germans had started to reposition, pulling men from some forward posts to reinforce others, tightening the seam of their defense in response to perceived movement. Morrison watched the shadow of their posture shift and felt the possibility of success hinge like a lantern above a chasm. He glanced at Chen and gave him a single nod, the sign that the feints should intensify slightly to push the perception over the edge. Kowalski saw the enemy begin to move in a way that did not signal aggression, but a careful consolidation. Men readjusted positions, and tools of defense were gathered. An order to withdraw seemed to hang like a question the commander had not yet dared to answer. They moved with the deliberation of people trying not to tip their own hand. If the German line chose to withdraw to avoid encirclement, it would likely be a disciplined pullback designed to maintain cohesion rather than a panic-driven rout. It was exactly the kind of outcome Morrison had hoped for. The Germans would leave their forward posts intact but vacated, and the Americans could then occupy the high ground with minimal bloodshed. B.A.'s breath was a measured thing now. He had become a composer of echoes, an artisan of sound.
Each call was an instrument, and the mountain its amphitheater. He did not shout, he projected, shaped, and moved. The calls were unfamiliar to the German ear, not because they were uncouth, but because they carried tonal patterns and rhythms that did not match the standard language of Allied troops. That unfamiliarity made them harder to categorize, and difficult things are always perceived as larger threats than they are. At the Crusoe Volant, a single German sentry raised the alarm, and the commander gave a terse order: prepare to withdraw to second-line positions. The word moved down the trench like a cold wind. Men began to pack, to sling their rifles, to pull up their machine gun positions. It was not instant chaos, it was a disciplined extraction. That discipline, ironically, was what made the withdrawal possible without turning into a disaster. The men had decided to cede the forward ground rather than risk encirclement and annihilation. Morrison heard the change in the enemy's tone and felt a tight relief settle within him. He did not exult, he checked his men, reminded them to maintain composure, and prepared to move. The plan had done what it aimed to do: alter the enemy's calculation. But the battle was not over. The ridge still had to be taken, and the Germans might choose at any moment to counterattack or to leave booby traps or mines in a hasty retreat. The tactical landscape was fragile. Bay, crouched in the shadow of a fir, listened to the rhythm of footsteps retreating and then stopped calling. He felt the cool, wary thrill of success, but also an immediate vigilance. The war cry had done its work. The men's next steps would determine whether that work would turn into a clear advantage. As the German positions began to thin, American squads prepared to move upward, not in a reckless charge, but in a disciplined climb with cover and support. Engineers in the platoon ready to inspect any abandoned positions for traps, Morrison ordered a measured advance to prevent an ambush. Just then, as the Americans began to make their cautious ascent, an unexpected sound rose from the German rear lines. Not a sound the Americans could place immediately, but enough to unsettle the careful balance they had achieved. It was a staccato of orders barked in German, an urgency that suggested not all was settled behind the ridge. For a heartbeat, uncertainty returned like a shadow. Had reinforcements been nearby, or was this the residual tension of soldiers aligning for a systematic withdrawal? Morrison's jaw tightened. He could not afford to gamble. Bay, who had been listening intently into the fog, raised his head slightly and peered in the direction of the sound. He could not see the enemy through the mist, but he could hear the cadence of command. His mouth formed the shape of another call that could either cement the illusion of a larger force or, if poorly timed, astonish the defenders into rallying. The decision weighed on him: to call again and risk drawing fire, or to stay silent and let the thin advantage slip. At that decisive instant, a German officer, again a figure whose precise name is indefinito in surviving reports, shouted an order to consolidate and to move back along a narrow track that ran behind the ridge. The movement suggested a withdrawal that was meant to be controlled. The men on the ridge began to step away from their forward posts, carrying with them only what they could quickly take. The Americans watched, held their positions, and prepared their own steps. The moment teetered between victory and renewed danger. The story holds here, on the knife edge of action. The Americans had forced a decision by using a voice and the properties of landscape to alter enemy perception. The Germans were executing a withdrawal aimed at preserving their fighting capability, but withdrawals are delicate operations and can, in the wrong conditions, unravel into flight. Morrison signaled to keep the men ready, not to charge blindly, not to gloat, but to move forward when the moment allowed for secure occupation of the ridge. Bayet remained where he was, the man who had transformed a memory into a weapon, listening for the brittle sounds that might tell him whether his calls had delivered victory or simply provoked a dangerous reaction. This was not the end. The ridge still had to be taken, positions still had to be secured and inspected for traps. The capture, if it came, would not erase the ironies that sat beneath the surface. The fact that a culture suppressed at home could offer the knowledge that saved lives on a battlefield. The discomfort of admiration that could not be fully expressed in a military bureaucracy reluctant to credit what seemed unconventional. The men who would walk the ground after the Germans left would find belongings and footprints, the small artifacts of upper-echelon decisions and lower-level survival. But for now, mid-movement, the story pauses at the threshold of consequence. The war cry had changed the calculus. The Germans had decided to withdraw, compacting their line against the fear of encirclement. The Americans had not yet fully occupied the ridge. They prepared themselves to step into the enemy's trenches if and only if conditions proved safe. The possibility of a clean occupation hung in the fog like a banner ready to be raised or snatched away. There are ironies to be kept in mind as this scene holds. That the call which influenced an enemy's decision was learned in living rooms and on ridgelines far from battlefields. That the same nation that sometimes silenced such languages at home found itself in the field reliant upon them. That ingenuity is not the monopoly of manuals and doctrine, but survives in oral practice and lived skill.
These reflections would later become part of how veterans remembered that morning, but memory comes only after fact, and fact must be seized carefully and verified. At the edge of this turning point, the men tightened their grips. The air tasted of cold metal and wet pine. B adjusted his position and decided, in the sliver of time between orders and action, whether to make one final call to hasten the withdrawal or to cease entirely and let the German decision settle. Morrison watched the line, and in that continual weighing of possible futures, he kept his men from rushing into the smallest likelihood of danger. In warfare, sometimes the greatest skill is knowing when to wait. What followed that choice would determine more than the fate of a platoon. It would seed a story of ingenuity, of cultural contradiction, and of a small human decision that rippled outward. But before the next sound could be sent, before boots could cross the enemy parapet, the fog and the ridge and the men on both sides were suspended in an almost holy balance. One voice had bent the course of action. Now it was the doing and the discipline of soldiers that would either make that bending hold or let it snap back into peril. The order to withdraw folded through the German line like a cold, efficient breath. Men moved with the practiced economy of soldiers who had been trained to preserve themselves first and their gear second. There was no panicked scattering. There were straps tightened, packs hoisted, the quick, habitual checks that come with a disciplined extraction. From the American perspective, the movement had the muted appearance of someone pulling curtains closed, deliberate, tidy, and designed to hide as much as possible what lay behind them. Morrison waited until the last sensible moment. He watched the enemy's retreat and counted the openings as if he were taking inventory of a risk. Only when the Germans' forward posts had thinned and a clear avenue up the slope presented itself did he order his men to advance. The climb was cautious. Engineers screened for booby traps and snares. Wary gestures from soldiers who knew that a position abandoned too quickly can be left dangerous by design. The ridge was taken not by a rush of triumph, but by a series of careful dominoes. A team clears a foxhole, another secures a parapet, a third sweeps a trench. When the Americans finally stood in the very earth the Germans had held, the absence of blood and the presence of hurriedly abandoned personal effects told the immediate story.
a half-packed ration box here, a thrown-down field jacket there, a machine gun sandbag abandoned in the flurry of leaving. The men moved like harvesters through those small artifacts, careful not to read too much into the private details of an enemy suddenly made vulnerable. They found few signs of a planned counterattack, no prepared ambush that would have betrayed an intention to spring back.
The ridge was theirs, gained with discipline, and the kind of luck that sometimes walks hand in hand with boldness. B.I. descended from his concealment only when Morrison signaled him to join the main body. He walked into the hollow of the enemy's previous posts with the quiet, focused gait of a man who had just performed something that belonged at once to skill and to luck. His radio, stowed against his shoulder all morning, felt like an instrument that had not sung. Men around him clapped shoulders and offered the brief soldier's congratulations, nods, grins, the exchange of cigarette for smoke. There were no parades, no formal citations handed out on that ridge. War rarely arranges itself into tidy ceremonies where they are due. Recognition, when it came, would arrive later, and in small, private ways. The immediate casualty figures were merciful in their simplicity. No American lives lost in the encounter, and the Germans withdrew intact enough to preserve their unit cohesion. The absence of blood on the American side was not a miraculous reprieve. It was the practical result of a decision to avoid direct assault and to use deception to tilt the odds. Still, the men felt a peculiar, relieved astonishment when Morrison confirmed aloud what all had hoped. They had taken the ridge without a costly exchange of gunfire. Securing the position, they also gained the tactical advantages that high ground confers. From that elevation, it was easier to observe movements in the valley, to place defensive fires if needed, and to interdict lines of communication. For the platoon, the ridge represented a breathing space, a place to reorient, to clean weapons, and to offer quick prayers or thoughts for home. Farther back, company commanders and battalion staffs would reassess their maps and consider how the loss of that forward position might create new options. Local momentum had shifted. Whether that shift would prove strategically decisive was a matter to be judged in the days to come by commanders with a broader view than a single platoon. Word of the encounter trickled through the command chain. Reports described an enemy withdrawal and the method by which it had been induced. Some officers received the account with the pragmatic interest of those who habitually catalog what works and what does not. Others registered a stylistic curiosity, an instance where local knowledge and improvisation shaped tactical outcomes. But the military, as an institution, tends toward documentation and formal citation. Stories that live in the margins, those born of oral tradition and individual improvisation, can struggle to find their place in official records. That reality would shape how the memory of that ridge entered the archives and the veterans' narratives. In the weeks that followed, the capture of the ridge contributed to a modest but real loosening of the German defensive line in that sector.
Forces moved to cover the vacated ground, and the Allies exploited the new gap to press forward in a local advance that, while not a strategic turning point, eased supply lines and reduced immediate pressure on neighboring units. Historical accounts would later describe the action as one of many small shocks and adjustments that together defined the grinding progress of a campaign. The ridge itself became one of those waypoints, an example of how moment-to-moment decisions, improvised under pressure, can tilt operations at the edges. For the men involved, the emotional aftermath was uneven. Morrison returned to his duties with the practiced modesty of someone who had been a teacher before a lieutenant. He praised his men quietly and filed his after-action report with the crispness of a man who preferred facts to flourish. Sergeant Chen continued to perform the relentless, practical work of non-commissional leadership, settling disputes, issuing rations, and keeping younger soldiers' nerves from fraying. Kowalski, the young soldier from Detroit, carried the memory of that morning with him like a scar softened by time, vivid, but not always easy to talk about. Thomas B.A.'s recollections would later populate the conversations veterans had in mess halls, reunion tables, and letters home. He spoke not in headlines but in details, the timing of a call, the place where a rock altered an echo, the way a fog can conceal not only bodies but intentions. For those who listened closely, his account was a lesson in how cultural knowledge, preserved across generations, can translate into tactical advantage. Yet recognition of that lesson was complicated by the social context of the era. At home, many Native American languages and practices had been suppressed by policies that valued assimilation. To see a Navajo voice used as a weapon abroad introduced an uncomfortable irony. A people whose language had been discouraged on domestic soil had given skills that, in a foreign landscape, saved lives. Veterans' memoirs and oral histories would keep the story alive in personal archives.
In those retellings, the ridge became a place where ingenuity had trumped brute force and where an individual's memory of ancestral practice had been repurposed for survival. Yet the official record did not always reflect the nuance or names these veterans offered. Bureaucracy is slow and exacting. It prefers documents with signatures and citations. Stories sewn from memory and improvised deeds sometimes circulate for decades before historians reconcile them with archival evidence. There were, too, human ripples that stretched beyond the immediate actors. Some accounts suggest that among the Germans who withdrew that day were young conscripts whose lives would later take unexpected turns. One face in particular appears in several reminiscences as a pale, frightened youth who later emigrated after the war.
The details of such a life, of the soldier's name, the path that led him from a ridge in wartime Europe to a new life abroad, are, where surviving records of thin, best handled with care. These are the kinds of human threads that historians chase, the small lives that, when traced, illuminate the broader human cost and consequence of conflict. Where names and trajectories remain uncertain, they should be treated as provisional, the product of memory rather than a closed dossier of verified fact. The cultural lesson the Ridge offered became part of how veterans framed the war's contradictions. Bay's example was not an isolated curiosity, but a pointed reminder that forms of power and forgetfulness exist side by side. A language suppressed in classrooms could be decisive on the battlefield. A quiet, place-based intelligence might outmaneuver a doctrine written at headquarters. The story forced a quiet reckoning about what societies value and what they neglect until confronted with necessity. In subsequent years, conversations about the role of Native Americans in the war, about code talkers and scouts, about the cultural competencies these men brought with them, would grow more public. The Ridge incident, like many such vignettes, lived both in the private memory of those who had been there and in the growing awareness that a fuller history must make room for non-traditional contributions. Museums, oral history projects, and veterans associations began to collect testimonies that filled in gaps left by formal reports. Yet even as narratives widened, the danger of romanticizing or reducing complex traditions to tactical anecdotes remained. Veterans and historians alike stressed that Bay's calls were not supernatural but skillful, a practiced application of acoustic awareness and human timing. The men who had shared that morning sometimes returned to it in quiet conversations decades later. They spoke about fear and cunning, about the way a voice moved through a landscape, and made practical men reassess risk. They told the story not as a parable, but as a living memory that complicated simple ideas of valor. In telling it, they honored Bay's learning and the tacit systems of knowledge that communities pass from one generation to the next. They also confronted an uncomfortable truth. Nations can both rely upon and marginalize the same people, and remembrance can be a way to correct, in small measure, the slights of the past. Public recognition, when it arrived, tended to fragment. Casual retellings in newspapers and regimental histories did note the oddity of the event, a voice used as a tool of deception, but often without the contextual depth veterans supplied in private. Scholarly interest grew later, as historians looked for examples of non-conventional tactics and the role of indigenous knowledge. Yet the documentation remained variegated: interviews, letters, and a handful of after-action notes that referenced an unusual acoustic deception.
Careful historians resist inserting the event into sweeping narratives as a decisive turning point. Instead, they treat it as a revealing case study of improvisation and human agency at the tactical level. For the soldiers who lived through it, however, the episode was more straightforward. It had been a day on which a neighbor's voice did what doctrine could not. It reshaped an immediate decision and kept men alive. That simplicity carried with it an ethical dimension. The men felt gratitude not only for the tactical outcome, but for the lesson that skill and culture, often undervalued, have practical worth. They returned to civilian lives in which such lessons could be awkward. How does a peacetime society honor knowledge that it had previously treated as unimportant? Answers came slowly, in community halls and veterans' reunions, in the quiet gratitude of those who had been saved. As the years passed, the Ridge remained a waypoint in a larger landscape of memory. Bay lived with the private knowledge of what he had done, neither seeking laurels nor silent about the fact. Morrison continued in roles that suited his temper, teaching, instructing, managing, and carrying the silent ledger of who had lived and who had not. Sergeant Chen and Kowalski kept their own versions of the morning, stories calibrated by time but not softened beyond recognition. Their accounts, when gathered with others, became a chorus that reflected both the practical skill of a young Navajo soldier and the broader dynamics of a military at war, its capacity for improvisation, its discomfort with deeds that fall outside bureaucratic expectation, and its reliance on individuals who brought gifts that training does not always capture. The Ridge story leaves public audiences with several clear takeaways. First, ingenuity matters. Under pressure, individuals can convert memory and place-based skill into instruments that change outcomes. Second, perception is often as decisive in combat as firepower. A well-crafted illusion, especially in terrain that favors mystery and in an enemy primed by fear, can tip a balance without bloodshed. Third, cultural knowledge is a resource. To devalue it is to blind oneself to potential advantage. And finally, memory matters. The way veterans remember an event and how societies record it shapes whether contributions are honored or lost. There is also a quiet moral that lingers. Respect for the knowledge of others is not merely an ethical obligation, but a practical one. The same society that had at times sought to silence indigenous languages was in war using one as a weapon of survival. That contradiction is uncomfortable, and telling the story frankly is part of making sense of it. Years later, when veterans gathered and the conversation turned to the Ridge, the men often fell silent long enough to listen to one another.
They exchanged the small details: who moved where, how B timed a call at a certain rock, how a rifle crack seemed timed to confirm movement. They laughed, they sighed, they spoke of humility and luck. They also pressed the point that the victory had been collective. A voice still mattered, but it mattered most because a platoon trusted it, followed its cues, and disciplined its advance to seize the moment. If you find yourself wondering what a single voice can do in a world of ordnance and generals, the Ridge offers one answer. Under the right conditions, voice and terrain and will can conspire to make a difference. The story is both a historical vignette and a reminder that small acts of innovation, rooted in culture and sharpened by need, can change the course of events in measurable ways. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more untold World War II moments and leave a comment about which unexpected tactics surprised you most. There are more stories where this came from: small decisions, local ingenuity, and the human moments that history sometimes forgets.